We're not hiring maids dressed like cosplay cops here. He, a white police officer, tied her hands with plastic restraints in the middle of the train tracks, pressed a gun to her forehead, stomped on her wrist with his boot, and spat on the ground right beside her. He didn't ask for her name. He only saw her skin color. But what he didn't know was that the woman he humiliated was the newly appointed federal chief of police, assigned directly by the Attorney General's office. When the enforcer of the law tramples the law, who defends the dignity of justice, watch until the end to find your answer. The sky was a flat, heavy gray, the kind that blurred the horizon into the concrete, suffocating light into shadow. Even the air felt pale, like it had been drained of color. A single vehicle pulled off the side of the nearly deserted road, its tires crunching against gravel that sounded too loud for the silence. The door opened, and out stepped a woman, tall, dark-skinned, shoulders squared with the kind of stillness that wasn't just composure but conviction. Her white button-down shirt glowed against the muted landscape, tucked neatly into mustard cellar pants that clashed defiantly with the world around her. The yellow wasn't soft. It was deliberate, sharp. It refused to blend in. She had barely shut the car door when footsteps crunched behind her. Not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. She turned, and there he was, Rick Halston in full uniform, badge gleaming under the dead sky like a weapon polished for show. He didn't ask if she was lost, didn't offer help. His eyes scanned her from head to toe like a barcode he didn't like the price of. His voice landed before his presence fully did, clipped and cold. We're not hiring maids. The words didn't shock her, but they did freeze the air between them. She stood still, no blink, no flinch. Rick's gaze dipped, lingering on her pants. His lip curled. That yellow's offensive. Makes my head hurt. The silence that followed didn't beg for explanation. It was the kind that swallowed it whole. She took one step forward, calm, without urgency. Rick stepped closer, faster, closing the gap not as a man meeting another person, but like a wall pressing in. He reached out with one gloved finger and jabbed it into the small patch sewn over her left breast. It read, "Federal Marshal," in block print beneath a small, glinting badge. He tapped it once. Is this a toy, or are you just cosplaying? His finger lingered a beat too long, then slid away as he casually lifted his shoulder mic and pressed the record button. Click. But he didn't say a word into it. The red light blinked silently, catching the moment but omitting the context, as if waiting for her to misstep so it could pounce. The performance wasn't for clarity. It was a trap with no bait. She didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for any ID, didn't correct him. She simply looked him in the eye, level, unshaken, uncompromising. And then, one sentence, delivered like steel through cotton. "I'm looking for justice, not judgment." The words hit harder than anything she could have shouted. Rick's jaw tightened. He didn't move back, didn't move forward, just stood there, nostrils flaring, eyes squinting, not from confusion but insult. Her tone hadn't been defiant, it had been factual. That made it worse. Behind them, the road stretched empty. No cars, no audience, no one else to diffuse or distort. Just two figures standing alone under a colorless sky, a blot of white and a streak of yellow daring not just to stand, but to be seen. And Rick, the self-anointed gatekeeper, didn't like that. He said nothing else, just breathed heavy once through his nose, nodded slowly like something inside him had been quietly dared and refused to lose. He turned, boots crushing the gravel beneath him, walked 2 steps, then stopped. "You'll want to turn around," he said over his shoulder. "There's nothing for you up ahead." She didn't respond. Not with words. Her silence wasn't compliance. It was condemnation. The sky above them remained blank and expressionless, but something had shifted, just slightly, beneath it. The air wasn't quite as pale. The silence is not quite as empty. She stood still, her figure outlined in yellow and white against the ash-colored backdrop, refusing to fade. Rick didn't turn again. He walked back to his patrol vehicle, hand resting near, but not on his weapon, like a man who felt something slip but wouldn't admit he ever held it. She stood alone for a long time after he left, unmoved. The wind picked up a little, tugging gently at her shirt, wrapping itself around her like memory. Then she turned, stepped back into her car, shut the door with precision, and drove off toward the station he said wasn't for her. The road didn't stop her, the air didn't swallow her, and the color she wore, it just kept burning. She kept driving. The road bled into steel, coiling toward the rusted edge of an old freight line that cut the horizon like a scar. Her knuckles tightened on the steering wheel, but her breath stayed calm, deliberate. The yellow of her pants remained vivid under the faint smog-gray light, a lone flare against the land that refused to make space for it. The town, or what was left of it, curled around itself in silence. But silence wasn't safety, not here. The tires hadn't even cooled when she stepped out again, this time by the rail crossing, empty but humming with old echoes. The wind had teeth now, biting sharper than before. She scanned the road, mapped the coordinates in her mind. No signposts, no station, no welcome. Only steel, concrete, and that same heavy breathlessness clinging to the air like dust after an impact. That was when the voice returned, no longer from behind her but from the side, cutting through space like a scalpel. "I warned you." She turned slowly. No rush, no fear. Rick Halston was already advancing, boots methodical, one hand on his belt, the other twitching slightly, as if daring itself to act before his mind fully caught up. The sneer on his face hadn't faded, it had ripened, sharpened into something more dangerous. Insult turned mission. "I hate the quiet ones," he muttered as he pulled a strip of white plastic from his pocket. Zip tie, thick, military grade. "You think it makes you powerful? Huh? That kind of silence, that stillness. You think it unnerves me?" He didn't wait for an answer. Didn't want one. He grabbed her wrist with practiced speed, the kind of force that didn't scream but snapped. The plastic cinched tight. She didn't resist, didn't recoil, but her muscles locked, not in panic but in defiance. Her breath stayed steady. Her eyes never wavered. That only made him angrier. "You should have turned around," he spat, dragging her closer to the edge of the railroad bed. The tracks sat like a guillotine, motionless but always ready. But no, you had to walk in here like you owned the place. With a shove that was more insult than necessity, he forced her down to her knees beside the tracks, gravel digging into her legs, blood rising faintly along her skin like protest. She didn't make a sound. He moved behind her, tightened the plastic bind again, then used the toe of his boot to grind her hand into the gravel, pressing down until the bones groaned beneath his weight. Still, no scream, not even a hiss. Rick crouched beside her, and for a moment, the world narrowed to just breath and gravel and the metallic scent of friction. He leaned in, voice low, coated in mockery. "Say something," he whispered. "Beg, yell, anything." She didn't. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, not out of avoidance, but dominance. She was staring straight at the future, even as the past tried to stomp it out. "You know what I can't stand?" he continued, voice quieter now, so close it brushed her skin. "People like you. The ones who think their silence is righteous. That makes you better. It doesn't. It makes you pathetic." And then, casually, like brushing dust from a windowsill, he drew his sidearm. It clicked as it came free of the holster, a cold, sharp sound that cut through the static of the wind. He didn't raise it right away, just let the weight dangle for a moment, theatrical, cruel. Then he leveled it at her temple. No shaking, no warning, no justification, just metal to skin, backed by a man whose smirk bled into the barrel like poison. Her breath didn't hitch, not even a ripple. A thin line of blood had begun to trail from her hairline where gravel had kissed too hard, but she didn't blink it away. She just looked at him, not through him, not past him, directly, forcefully, with a clarity that stripped away every badge he thought protected him. "I don't bow," she said, her voice a blade sliding from a sheath. "Not even when there's a gun in my face." For a second, just a second, something slipped in Rick's eyes. Not fear, he wasn't built that deep, but recognition. Like he'd just realized he wasn't staring at a threat, he was staring at a verdict. Her words didn't crack. They didn't rise. They landed. Like an earthquake made from syllables. He leaned in closer, nostrils flaring, the gun pressed tighter now, its presence a dare. But she didn't look at it. She looked at him, and he hated that more than anything. The wind cut through again, lifting a piece of her white shirt that fluttered like a flag refusing to surrender. The only sound was the quiet metal shift of his finger teasing the trigger, followed by the dull, hollow click of the safety being thumbed. Still, she didn't blink. Rick exhaled through clenched teeth, then said it, barely above breath. "You're a goddamn problem." He said it like it was prophecy, like he already knew she wasn't going to vanish, like some part of him, buried deep, had started to understand that the more he pressed down, the more visible she became. Behind them, the wind carried dust across the dead tracks, swirling around two locked figures, one in control of a weapon, the other in control of everything else. He had the gun, the badge, the voice, but she had the silence, and in that silence, she had all the power. Then, slowly, she lifted her head just an inch higher, not in defiance, but in declaration. The light caught her cheekbone, the streak of blood tracing down her skin like war paint. She didn't break his stare, not even when the muzzle of his weapon trembled just slightly. She didn't move, she didn't plead, she simply was present, whole, and untouchable. And that, more than anything, terrified him. The barrel of the gun hadn't moved, but the moment had already shifted. Somewhere just beyond the rail bed, tucked behind a rusted utility box and half-crouched beneath a patch of dead brush, a hand trembled. The lens of a phone camera, cracked once across its upper corner, tilted ever so slightly. The person holding it said nothing, didn't breathe loudly, didn't blink, only recorded, because something in their bones screamed not to look away. From the low angle of the phone's eye, the scene unfolded like a documentary nightmare, grainy, sun-flicked, and realer than anything ever aired on the evening news. Rick Halston, in full uniform, stood with his boots planted wide, one pressing down on the plastic-bound wrists of the woman beneath him. His arm extended forward, gun held firm and arrogant against her forehead. Her head was tilted just slightly, not in surrender, but to keep him in her sight. There was blood, not much, but enough to matter. It curled from her temple like a thread unspooling, vivid against the paper white of her shirt. The camera caught it all. Her breath didn't hitch. Her arms, bound tight, didn't flinch, but the sinews of her forearms flexed, not in struggle, but in readiness, like something coiled that refused to snap. The lens trembled as the person behind it exhaled too sharply, then adjusted their grip. Still filming, still silent. Rick leaned in closer again, his shadow cutting a jagged edge across her face. His voice, low and filled with venom, slipped easily through the open air and straight into the mic. "You hold still like that? I gotta ask, federal training? Or are you just into pain?" He laughed. A sound without joy. More of a bark, short and serrated, meant to pierce rather than amuse. The camera's zoom edged in, not digitally but physically, the person behind it moving just a touch forward, the gravel underfoot grinding too loudly even in their ears. But they didn't stop. The screen shimmered as the sunlight, heavy and slanted, finally broke through the choking gray of the sky and fell like a spotlight onto the woman's face. It hit her not like grace, but like truth. It illuminated the blood. The bruise was just forming along her jaw, the cut near her eyebrow. But more than that, it illuminated her stare. Her eyes didn't plead, didn't even challenge. They recorded, too, every inch of Rick's face, every pulse in his neck, every twitch of control he thought he had. She watched him with the scrutiny of someone who had already seen beyond him. The wind caught her shirt again, a soft flutter, almost soundless, but the microphone on the phone caught it, just barely, along with the sound of Rick's boot shifting, grinding the gravel deeper into her skin. Her fingers twitched, bound and bloodied, but her body never recoiled. The veins in her hands stood out, stiff and unmoving. A portrait of pain refused. Rick noticed. Of course he did. The restraint, the calm, the unbearable grace, it enraged him. He hissed into her ear, words wrapped in heat. You think not screaming makes you stronger? It makes you dumb. This isn't how you win. The camera caught the twitch in his jaw as he said it, the way his voice cracked slightly at the end, not with fear, but with frustration. She didn't answer. Her lips were parted only slightly, breath slow and even, and that silence, the one he'd called weakness, stretched long enough to make the observer behind the lens forget to breathe. The phone shook again, just a flicker. The frame blurred for a heartbeat before refocusing. The wind carried dust and tension in equal measure. The sun kept its angle, stubborn and unwavering. Rick pulled back the hammer on the gun with a snap that echoed louder than it should have. He wasn't going to shoot. Not yet, but the performance demanded punctuation. The lens flinched. The hands filming dug into the dirt for balance, but the feed didn't stop, because something about the stillness, about the woman's refusal to give Rick what he wanted, noise, fear, movement, held the watcher hostage. She wasn't resisting, she was enduring, and there was something ancient, something unspeakably strong, in the act of simply not collapsing. He crouched again, breathing heavily, sweat beginning to line his brow, though the day wasn't warm. I could end this, he muttered. Right here. No one would blink. But he was wrong, because someone was blinking. Someone was watching. Someone had seen it all, from the moment he mocked her badge to the moment he pressed steel to her skin. And that someone, scared as they were, wasn't leaving. The camera caught a slow drop of blood sliding down the side of her face and landing on the gravel, red against gray, soft against sharp, and then it caught her lips. Closed, tight, but calm. Not a wince, not a snarl, just that same impossible calm, as if what she bore wasn't shame, but witness. And Rick, for all his dominance, for all his barking, was now part of something he didn't control. A frame, a story, a truth larger than him. The sun held its gaze on her, as if honoring her defiance. The camera kept rolling, and somewhere, inside a pair of shaking hands, a piece of history was being carved. The frame didn't end when the gun lowered. The phone in that shaking hand never stopped recording, not even as Rick spat on the ground, his saliva landing inches from her bound hands, pooling against the gravel like insult turned physical. The camera caught that, too. The smirk that followed, the way he flexed his neck as if the moment had granted him dominion. He turned his back on her like she wasn't a person, but a stain. And for a few heartbeats, it might have ended there. But the internet doesn't forget what justice tries to bury. The video went up 12 hours later. No filter, no edit, just a 7-minute stream titled, "Cop Ties Up Black Woman by the Tracks." The thumbnail was simple, her face half lit by sunlight, her head down but never bowed, blood threading from her temple in a line that cut across the screen like punctuation. Within minutes, the views spiraled into the thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. It was chaos dressed as clarity. The first wave was fury. Commenters screaming in all caps, hashtags multiplying like brush fire. The audio caught Rick's voice clearly, especially the moment he crouched and said, "You think not screaming makes you stronger?" One viewer wrote, "This is why we film everything." Another, "What if she outranks him? What if he just trusts up his new boss?" A third, colder and sharper, "He didn't just tie her to the tracks, he tied America to its reflection." Then came the edits. Someone layered in a haunting piano riff, soft and mournful, behind the footage. The way it rose just as he pushed her down made the entire clip feel like a requiem, not for her, but for him, for the system, for everything that cracked in that 7-minute assault. Within 24 hours, news stations scrambled to verify. They froze frames, enhancing Rick's badge, looping his spit hitting the gravel, and slowing down the recoil of her neck when he tightened the zip tie. One journalist called it the most chilling use of silence ever caught on camera. Another referred to her as the calm in the storm, stoic, bloodied, unbroken. Someone zoomed in on her eyes. There it was again, that unrelenting gaze. Even as she bled, even as the gun pressed into her forehead, she stared at him like he was the one being judged. It haunted people. It enraged them because no one knew who she was, and that anonymity made her everyone. Rick didn't stay anonymous for long. Internet sleuths had his full name, precinct, and prior record pulled within hours. His wedding photo appeared, so did a blurry shot from a past bar fight. None of it was illegal, but in the court of public perception it painted a pattern. Someone found a quote from a podcast he'd guested on, "We need to remind people who's in charge." That line resurfaced over and over, paired with a still of him grinding his boot into her wrist. Then came the meme war. One viral post split the screen. Left side showing Rick in uniform beneath an American flag mural. Right side showing him kneeling on the side of the tracks with his gun out. Caption, "Serving and protecting who?" Another used the same footage with bold text, "The man who tied justice to the rails." It stuck. The hashtag Rick the Railroad trended globally for 2 straight days. He tried to release a statement. It failed. Anything he said would have been drowned anyway. No explanation could outrun the image of him looming over her like an executioner. The silence in that clip screamed louder than any denial. One late-night host played the full footage uninterrupted, the studio audience watching in complete silence. When it ended, the host didn't joke. He just said, "If this doesn't wake you up, you're not asleep. You're complicit." People protested, not just locally, not just for her, but because, in those 7 minutes, the country saw itself flawed, brutal, unblinking. She still hadn't spoken. The world was screaming for her name, her story, her side. But the power of the video was that she didn't speak. She didn't explain. She just endured. And in that, she spoke for more than herself. A comment with 200,000 likes read, "That's not strength, that's a sermon." Rick, meanwhile, had his problems. Reporters camped outside his station. Activists demanded his badge. The mayor released a vague, trembling statement about an internal investigation. But it wasn't enough, because the storm had no off switch. The video played on repeat in diners, on subway screens, in classrooms, and every time his face hit the screen, someone new whispered, "He should have known better." He had become the symbol of something rotting, and she, unnamed, unyielding, had become its reckoning. The storm didn't knock. It seeped in through cracks. Rick Halston still clung to his routines like they held the world in place. His badge, though suspended unofficially, still hung heavy from his belt. His boots still stomped the same linoleum. And on that morning, the one where everything finally tilted, he was making coffee. Same cup, same machine, same 2 scoops, stirred without care. The air smelled like burnt arrogance. He didn't see the black SUVs glide up to the station, didn't hear the low crunch of government boots slicing across the parking lot. He missed the final seconds of the calm because he was humming, not a tune, just a pattern, a shallow rhythm meant to keep something darker at bay. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Usually there was chatter. Some junior officer whining about paperwork, a radio cracking a traffic update, chairs scraping tile. But that morning, everything had muted. Rick turned, mug half full, brows twitching with irritation. "What's with the funeral vibe?" he muttered. Then the front doors opened, and the sound returned, like a verdict. Heavy boots, tight formation, black vests with gold-lettered jackets. No greetings, no introductions, just a federal presence, cutting through the room like a buzzsaw. Rick straightened slightly, but didn't flinch. "Can I help you?" The lead agent stepped forward. Voice clipped. "Richard Halston, under direct order of the Department of Justice, you are to be taken into custody pending federal indictment." Rick scoffed, laughed, dry, sharp, full of disbelief. "You're kidding." No one smiled. Hands grabbed his arms. The mug dropped, shattered. Coffee splashed like spilled oil across the floor. And then came the click, the metallic, echoing click of steel cuffs replacing the authority he thought permanent. He twisted, voice rising. "I've got rights, damn it!" No answer. The agents moved like choreography, practiced and brutal. He was pushed forward. "Wait," he barked, neck jerking toward his colleagues. "You're just going to watch this? Really? No one's got my back?" Silence. A sea of uniforms stared through him. Not at him, through him. Cold, distant. Even the ones who used to laugh at his jokes. Even the ones he'd vouched for. "You cowards," he shouted. "I trained half of you." No one spoke. One officer adjusted his cap. Another stepped out of the way without a word. Rick thrashed, trying to plant his feet. "I'm being set up. This is political. I'm being played," he screamed. That's when he saw her. She didn't walk forward. She didn't raise a voice. She just stood near the rear hallway. Arms crossed, spine straight, eyes locked on him like a silent verdict. Same face, same stare. The one he'd spat near, the one he'd tied to gravel. No badge displayed, no weapon needed. Just presence, immovable, irrefutable. His voice cracked. You're behind this?" He said nothing, didn't blink, didn't flinch. They shoved him again, down the steps, through the echoing corridor, past desks that once answered to him. His feet stumbled. The cuffs bit into his wrists. The air outside hit him colder than it should have. "I was protecting this town," he howled, twisting once more. "You people don't get it. I was keeping order." The van door opened, black steel. Inside, shadows. One of the agents placed a hand on Rick's shoulder, too firm to shake. He resisted, feet scraping pavement. "Get your hands off me. This is a mistake." But the agent didn't care. None of them did, because mistakes didn't scream this loud. Mistakes didn't leave 7-minute proof on every screen in the country. Rick twisted again, this time violently. "Say something," he roared toward the door of the station. "Someone speak up. Don't let them take me like this." And still silence. He looked back. For a breath, the agents paused. And that's when he tried to wrench free, flinging his shoulder back in desperation. It didn't work. The reaction was swift. One arm behind his back. A boot forward. His body slammed against the van's frame. Skull met steel with a dull, gutting thud. His cry wasn't defiant this time. It was guttural, winded. One leg buckled. Blood trickled from his scalp, thick and dark against pale skin. They didn't wait for him to find his balance again. 2 men lifted, one pulled, and then he was inside. The door slammed. Silence outside. The morning had turned. Inside the station, the clock still ticked. The sunlight hit the floor tiles like it always had, but Rick Halston was gone, stripped, dragged, and no one had moved to stop it. Back near the hallway, she still stood, watching. Her expression is unreadable. Her breath was steady. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She simply bore witness. Because justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it walked in at dawn, cuffed the loudest man in the room, and left no echoes behind. They brought him in through the service entrance. Less about secrecy, more about containment. Rick Halston shuffled into the courtroom in a beige suit, too clean for a man who cornered justice at gunpoint. His wrists bore the imprint of restraint, though the cuffs had been removed. He held his head high, but it was a borrowed posture. The moment he entered, every camera lens in the gallery locked on him, and the sound in the room shifted. No louder, no fuller, but tight, denser, as if everyone inside had started holding their breath in sync. He scanned the chamber like it still belonged to him. The judge, the jury, the polished floor. He looked at them the way a man scans property lines. His lawyers flanked him, unreadable, rehearsed. Across the aisle, government officials sat with their hands folded neatly. like loaded weapons wrapped in silence. Then she walked in. The murmurs started before her name was even announced. She entered not as a victim, not as a plaintiff, but as something else entirely. Authority wrapped in poise. Clarity dressed in black and white. Her presence cut through the room like a ruling before the hearing began. Rick saw her, stiffened, but didn't look away. The bailiff's voice rang out, flat and formal. Court is now in session. The judge, woman of lean frame and measured eyes, nodded once, her gavel tapping twice. We begin the hearing of Case 2147. Defendant, Richard Halston. Charges abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, civil rights violation, and aggravated assault under federal statute. Rick shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching against the wood. His lawyer leaned in, whispered. Rick didn't respond. The prosecution opened with evidence. Short, brutal, surgical. The video played again. No music, no edits. Just raw footage, sound intact, silence deafening. The courtroom didn't stir, not during the boot, not during the spit, not during the gun to her forehead. The judge turned to her. "Ma'am, you were the individual shown in the video." She stood slowly, voice firm but not loud. "Yes." "Please state your name for the record." There was a pause, no hesitation. Timing, Chief U.S. Marshal Alexandria Vance. The ripple that moved through the courtroom wasn't audible, it was internal. The shift, the lurch. Rick jolted upright, mouth parting before the comprehension finished its route. "Repeat that," the judge said. Vance reached calmly into the folder before her, extracted a sealed document. She handed it to the clerk, who passed it forward. The judge opened it. Blue ink, red seal, fresh signature from the Office of the Attorney General. "As of 3 weeks ago," Vance said, "I was appointed to serve as Federal Chief Marshal, Division 3, Eastern Jurisdiction. I was en route to assume position at the time of the incident recorded." The room held its breath. Rick erupted. No, this is manipulation." He stood, neck flushed, eyes wild. "You can't do this." She didn't identify herself. "This is entrapment." The bailiff moved. So did 2 guards. Rick tried to step forward, but a firm hand hit his chest. "This is a setup," he barked again. "This is political theater." The judge didn't blink. "Mr. Halston, sit down or be removed." He fought the command with his posture, but obeyed the words. Vance remained still, watching him without emotion. "I did not identify myself," she said, "because I was not there to assert rank. I was there to begin a job. And I was intercepted, not questioned, not processed, not detained properly, but violently subdued by a man who believed he had nothing to fear from consequences." The judge looked at the defense. "Do you wish to challenge the legitimacy of this document?" Rick's lawyer looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He shook his head. Vance stepped forward once, her hands resting lightly on the table. "Let me make this clear," she said, voice low but absolute. "I'm the woman you trussed up like a criminal. I'm the badge you mocked. I'm the face you spat near. And now I'm the authority you thought couldn't exist in someone like me." Rick's fists clenched, his mouth opened, but nothing came out. "I'm not here because I was offended," she continued. "I'm here because the system needs to be reminded that power isn't proven by posture or voice volume. It's proven by restraint, by justice, by accountability." She didn't look at the jury. She didn't need to. The judge set down the document. Her voice was sharp, clean. "This court acknowledges the plaintiff's position and the federal context of this case. The events depicted in the footage are not merely a violation of civil code, they are a rupture of trust, rank, and the structural foundation of authority." Rick twitched. "The fact," the judge continued, "that you restrained a federal officer under the assumption of superiority without identification, inquiry, or report removes this case from personal misconduct and places it within a breach of federal integrity." Rick stood again, fists slamming on the desk. "She tricked me." The courtroom didn't move. Vance looked at him, calm as ice. "I gave you the chance to assess. You chose to assume." He pointed at her, the gesture wild. "You didn't tell me who you were." "And you didn't care to ask," she replied. The judge lifted her gavel. "Enough." The wood struck once. "This is no longer about individual behavior, it's about systemic disease. This court will proceed under the full scope of federal review." Rick sat hard. His breath stuttered. His spine curled inward. She returned to her seat, poised, unshaken. In the gallery, not a single word was spoken. No whispers, no shuffle, just the weight of her truth hanging in the air, like judgment rendered in ink and bone. The courtroom didn't breathe, not in the silence that followed Vance's declaration, not in the aftermath of Rick's outburst. It had become a crucible, heating by degrees, pressure mounting under the polished surface of decorum. And then, slowly, deliberately, the prosecution stood. The federal prosecutor was a man of lean frame and deliberate cadence, his voice dry, analytical, but with a current of electricity that dared you to underestimate the weight of his words. He approached the evidence table with the calm of someone holding the final pieces to a long, unfinished puzzle. "Your Honor," he began, eyes glancing at the jury, then to the defense. "With the court's permission, we will now enter 3 previously archived evidentiary recordings into the record. These materials were not admissible in prior local cases due to procedural gaps, but under federal oversight we now present them as pattern behavior, admissible under Rule 444. The judge nodded. "Proceed." The lights dimmed slightly. The first video rolled. No one spoke as the grainy footage lit the screen. There was no color, just cold black and white surveillance captured in the far corner of a precinct hallway. Rick Halston, 5 years younger but no less smug, had a man pressed against the wall. The man, a thin, unarmed Latino in street clothes, was gasping. Rick's forearm was pressed hard against the man's throat, elbow locked. His other hand rested casually on his hip like the scene was recreational. Rick's voice came through the clip with a hollow echo. "You gonna give me attitude now? Or later when you've pissed yourself?" The man choked out something unintelligible. Rick pressed harder. "Did I say you could breathe?" The clip was cut there. A rustle moved through the courtroom. Not a gasp, those were too theatrical for this setting. Just discomfort shifting in real time, morality twisting in chairs. The prosecutor didn't blink. That incident was never formally filed. The internal report lists resistance and verbal escalation, but omits any mention of physical restraint. No formal complaint was processed, no footage reviewed until now. Rick's attorney stirred. Rick leaned in and hissed into his ear. The lawyer stayed still. "Next exhibit," the prosecutor said. The second video played. This one was a body cam clip time-stamped during a nighttime traffic stop. Rick stood outside the driver's side window of a vehicle, flashlight angled into the face of a visibly nervous young black man. His tone was mocking, teeth bared in what wasn't a smile. "You know what keeps you alive, huh?" Rick said. "You're lucky. Your skin's not dark enough to spook me." There was a pause on the recording. The driver didn't respond. Rick tapped the window twice. "You think that's a joke? I've got 6 guys with worse luck than you rotting in cells. 'Cause they thought quiet made them clever." The video stopped. Rick's voice rose instantly. "That was taken out of context. That was sarcasm." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Halston, this is your only warning. Interrupt again, and I will hold you in contempt." He sank back, eyes flaming, jaw locked. The prosecutor advanced another step. "The driver in that recording filed a complaint. It disappeared in the system. Until subpoenaed, there was no known recording. A server mislabeling hid it from review." Rick's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, flipping pages that wouldn't help him. The third and final recording began. This time, the audio came from a wiretap, an internal sting that had never seen daylight until now. The voice was unmistakably Rick's, laced with that same condescension, stripped of any public polish. "I don't need a warrant," he was saying. "I need attitude. If they give me that, that's my green light. You give me the tone, I give you the boots. Simple math." The clip ended. No music, no drama, just the mechanical sound of the recording stopping and the air growing exponentially heavier. The prosecutor let it hang before speaking. These recordings, taken together, demonstrate a pattern of willful, racially charged conduct under the guise of enforcement. What they reveal isn't poor judgment. It is strategic abuse. A cultivated disregard for civil procedure disguised as field control. Rick stood again, trembling with rage. "I never laid a hand on anyone who didn't ask for it." His voice cracked. The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Halston, you are now held in contempt of court." Restrained the defendant. A guard moved to his side. Rick shoved back. "They're making me a symbol. They're twisting everything." Another bailiff closed in. Rick fought the grip. "This is garbage evidence. This is political. These were nobodies, thugs." Vance didn't move. She didn't need to. The judge's voice sliced through the rising noise. "Mr. Halston, enough. This courtroom does not revolve around your delusions of authority. It responds to law." Rick struggled once more, then sat, breathing like a cornered animal. His suit clung to him like a costume he no longer deserved. The prosecutor turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, this is not a trial of intent. This is a trial of behavior. And behavior leaves behind evidence, even when silence is forced, even when victims go unheard. Today, that silence speaks." The judge looked at the jury. "Let the evidence stand as submitted. Let it weigh what silence could not." And with that, the room exhaled. Silence wasn't the absence of noise anymore. It was the presence of reckoning. In the courtroom, after the videos, after the evidence that peeled back years of unchecked power, after Rick's final flailing protests, there was no more drama to inject, just process, procedure. Consequently, stepping forward in the shoes of inevitability. The jury didn't take long. 3 days of testimony had carved a truth so loud it no longer needed amplification. The room was full when they returned, but no one leaned forward. No one clutched their chest or dabbed their eyes. It was too cold for that, too clean, like air after a snowstorm. Still heavy, honest. Rick sat at the defense table, hands clenched, jaw set. His suit looked tighter than before, like it was shrinking with every hour he'd worn it. He didn't turn to his lawyer. He didn't glance at the gallery. His eyes flicked once toward the jury box, then locked forward again, waiting for the gavel to fall like a blade. The foreman stood, a woman in her 40s. Civilian, neutral, voice flat, practiced. In the matter of Richard Halston on charges of abuse of authority, obstruction of justice, civil rights violation, and aggravated assault, how does the jury find? She didn't blink. Guilty on all counts. A breath. Then, "We recommend the maximum sentence of 15 years without parole, with standard prison population assigned." The air shifted, not with gasps, not with outbursts, but with something deeper, something internal, as if the ground beneath Rick's chair had just dropped half an inch, and only he had felt it. He didn't speak at first. His body didn't move, but his left hand twitched once, then again, slowly, like a short-circuited signal trying to find its meaning. Then his lips parted. "No protective custody?" The words came out cracked, raw. The judge's gavel tapped once. "Sentencing recommendation accepted. The inmate will be assigned under the general population protocol. No special exemption granted." Rick's posture faltered, not collapsed, but curved, subtly, like a wire bending under heat. His throat worked around a breath, but it didn't come out clean. Vance didn't look at him, not right away. She sat still, spine unbowed. But as the judge finalized the sentence, her head dipped, not in triumph, not in relief, but in quiet mourning for the uniform, for the title, for the institution he had bled across concrete and headlines. She bowed her head like one honors a flag at half-mast. Rick's voice burst through again, jagged and desperate. "This is garbage," he barked, turning toward the bench. "You can't bury me like this. I'll appeal. Every damn ruling, every clip, every lie." No one responded. His lawyer didn't turn. Not even a glance. Rick's eyes snapped sideways. "Say something," he snapped at him. Still nothing. "Don't just sit there. I'm not done." His lawyer folded his hands. One thumb traced the edge of a notepad, deliberately avoiding eye contact. Rick spun again. "You don't understand. They twisted this. She set me up. I was doing my job." The judge didn't answer. She only nodded to the bailiff. And then Vance finally looked up. Her eyes found Rick's, calm and unflinching, not cruel, not cold. But finally, her voice carried across the chamber like a conclusion. "No one sentenced you," she said. "You chose your path long before we ever stepped into this room." Rick's shoulders flinched. A sound escaped his mouth, not a word, just a syllable that didn't know what it wanted to become. The bailiff approached, cuffs ready. Rick's knees bent slightly, almost involuntarily. The seat beneath him groaned with his shifting weight. The sound wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. The quiet creak of collapse, the groan of someone who finally realized the mountain he had stood on was made of paper and gasoline. He didn't scream again. He didn't raise his fists, just sat there as the cuffs wrapped again around wrists that used to point and judge and hold weapons like declarations. The steel kissed bone with a finality that no voice could undo. And behind him, beyond the seal of the court, the world moved on. No sirens, no headlines breaking mid-section, just gravity, doing what it was always designed to do. 15 years. No protective custody. The words were stamped on the air like ink pressed into wet paper. Soaked deep. Impossible to remove. Rick Halston was no longer a man on trial or even a man in uniform. He was a man in transit. Between headlines. Between holding cells. Between the memory of control and the permanence of consequence. But while he waited for his transfer, the world went to work. Not with verdicts, but with edits. The first video to resurface was his own. A clip he'd posted 3 years ago, unprompted, cocky, standing in front of a patrol car, sun behind him like a spotlight. "You don't want to give me attitude," he'd said into the lens, smirking. Sunglasses tilted down just enough to show the arrogance in his eyes. "I don't do warnings. I do reminders." That clip was now cut down to 12 seconds and titled, "Reminder, You're Not Untouchable." It opened with his smirk. It ended with the sound of courtroom cuffs clicking closed. It exploded. Then came the mashups. Someone found an old precinct Christmas party video. Rick dancing, exaggerated, hamming it up in uniform while mock arresting a fellow officer who happened to be black. At the time, it was meant to be funny. Now the footage had been slowed down, tinted in black and white, set to a somber piano cover of God Bless America. Every beat of the music matched his steps. Each motion now grotesquely choreographed, framed by bold text overlays. Enforcement or performance? Another version played the same clip but flipped the tone, adding circus music, hard cuts to his courtroom breakdown, zooming in on his sweat, his mouth twisting as the sentence dropped. His face became a meme, not the man, the face. That crooked, strained expression he wore when the judge said, "General population," had been screen captured and remixed across every platform. On Twitter, someone made a sticker pack. On TikTok, a filter. On Instagram, a story template. Rick the Railroad trended for 3 days straight. No one explained it. They didn't need to. The image of him, once draped in a badge and bravado, was now everywhere, framed by digital laughter and stitched with captions that sliced deeper than any headline. Tough guy. Tied up now, the tracks turned, tied justice to the rails, got run over by truth. He filed an appeal within a week, requested early reconsideration, filed it in thick ink, citing emotional duress, media bias, and political agenda. The judge didn't respond immediately. The system took its time now. When the rejection came, it was 2 lines long. Request denied. Motion without merit. No one mentioned it online. Not because no one noticed, because by then, his relevance had shifted. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a case study, a meme, a cautionary tale formatted for virality, the face of unchecked authority, caught under perfect lighting, perfect framing, and perfect timing. Inside the holding unit, Rick watched a news segment on a mounted TV. No sound, just headlines running like silent laughter under the footage. Former officer becomes social symbol. He stared at his face on the screen. His hands didn't move. His jaw didn't clench. His eyes, though, they blinked too fast, like someone trying to wake up from a dream they could already feel was permanent. There was no redemption arc, no dramatic speech, no chance to explain, because now every room he entered would remember the video, not the man. Every glance would carry the shape of the memes. Every inmate would see the smirk before the sentence. Every mirror would reflect not just guilt, but the frame it came in. And frames? They don't fade. The screen lit up quietly. No dramatic lead-in, no urgent music or spinning headlines, just a live feed cut to a single chair under a too-bright studio light, where an old man sat in uniform that had seen more years than most careers last. The insignia on his breast glinted once, then steadied. His posture was upright, but not rigid. He looked like someone who had survived too much to pretend anymore. The anchor didn't speak. The chyron read simply, "Retired officer and father of Richard Halston to speak." No title, no rank, just the blood link, just the weight. He didn't clear his throat or shift in his seat. He looked into the camera, eyes weathered but unblinking, and started speaking with a voice carved from gravel and regret. "I've worn this badge longer than I've worn the same name as my son," he said. Each word clean, slow, deliberate. "And today, I take one of those off." He reached into his breast pocket, not rushed, not shaking, and pulled out a silver badge with a hairline scratch running through the crest. He held it in his palm, fingers curved gently around it, like holding memory too sharp to press. "This badge belonged to my father," he said, "passed down through 3 generations. It sat on my vest when I walked into riots, when I pulled children out of burning cars, when I held dying men's hands and promised their families justice would mean something." He turned the badge in his hand. The light caught the metal. It sat on Rick's chest, too. Silence. Just the badge in the center of the frame now. "If there's one thing I regret," he said, voice slightly lower, "it's that I taught him how to fire a weapon before I taught him how to respect another human being." He didn't cry, didn't blink harder. His breath remained steady, as though this wasn't a confession, it was a ritual. Then he pulled a small tin box from beneath the chair. It was battered, the kind that once held candies or photos. When he opened it, the lid creaked. Inside were neatly folded letters, a ribbon, and a stack of yellowed citations tied with string. He placed the badge on top of the letters, closed the lid, exhaled. "My family's name doesn't belong on a uniform anymore," he said. The camera didn't cut away, it didn't zoom, it just let him be. A father, laying to rest not a son, but a lineage, a myth, a legacy that could no longer outrun the truth. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't apologize for Rick. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just placed the box on the floor beside him and walked off frame. No applause, no outro music, just the empty chair and the metal echo of an ending. Vance saw the broadcast later that night. Not live, not with popcorn or righteous satisfaction. She watched it alone in the quiet of her office, the room dim except for the flicker of the screen. When the father's voice faded and the chair sat still, she didn't react right away. Then, slowly, she inhaled and let the breath go. Not like a release, more like acknowledgement. There was no triumph in this, no victory lap, just something inside the system, exhaling with her. A reporter nearby whispered, not to her, but to the room, "There are some verdicts no court needs to deliver." She didn't reply, didn't need to. The box, the badge, the silence. They had already spoken. There was nothing left to add, no final word, no summation. That broadcast, barely 10 minutes long, closed not just a family lineage, but an entire definition of honor. The father didn't need to rise to exit the frame. Sitting still, placing the tin box gently at his feet was enough. The act made no sound, but the nation heard it, like a door closing on the era of justifications that had stretched too long, too thin, too far. The badge, once sacred, now sat buried beneath layers of silence more damning than words, and still No outrage, no performance, just gravity doing its work. One relic at a time. The studio dimmed after he left, the camera lingering for a moment too long on the empty chair, not out of sentiment, but out of certainty. No music, no outro, just the echo of consequence folding into legacy. There would be no press tour, no interviews. The man had said all he needed to say with a gesture. And gestures, when made with that much finality, don't fade. They frame everything after. Rick never commented, because some verdicts, when spoken by blood, leave no room for defense. It appeared as quietly as a breath in winter, unsought, unannounced, and unmistakable. The letter, typed neatly on plain ivory stock, had no header, no date, no name. But it was dated. It was time-stamped not by a machine, but by circumstance. It sat on the edge of the desk in the federal chief's private office, discovered not by an aide, but by a janitor, folded once, resting atop an unused blotter, as if placed with care and intent. The ink was still fragrant, the paper cool to the touch. 7 lines, no more, no less. Beneath them, a single fingerprint pressed deep in dark blue ink, unaccompanied by signature, name, or seal. It was the same day the verdict had been read, the same hour the cameras pivoted from the courtroom to the country's reaction. As journalists scurried to secure statements, talking heads framed narratives, and legal scholars parsed precedent, the letter made its quiet migration. From desk to hands, from hands to scanners, and from scanners into the bloodstream of a nation hungry not for outrage, but for reckoning. No one claimed authorship. No one needed to. The weight of the words carried their origin. The letter read, "My silence has never meant surrender. It is the space where justice learns to speak human. I do not need a title to bear consequences. I do not ask for applause. I ask for memory, for truth, for the slow, quiet dismantling of what was built to mute those who rise. If I am heard, let it be not because I shouted, but because the world finally listened." Below the text, the fingerprint pulsed like a blood-sealed promise, indelible, irreversible, intimate. It was scanned, reproduced, and published. Every major legal journal ran it under the same headline: "You do not need a rank to shift a system." It bypassed press releases and interviews, slipped past party lines and ideological fences, and landed where it was always meant to, in the eyes of those who had watched too long without blinking. It wasn't just a letter. It was an X-ray of a nation's bones. In the federal penitentiary 3 states away, Rick Halston sat on the edge of his narrow cot when it was slid under his door. A folded clipping from a paper one of the guards read religiously. He didn't open it right away, just stared at the seal of the publication. He knew the title before he unfolded it, knew the rhythm of the sentences before his eyes traced them, knew, with sickening certainty, the pressure behind that fingerprint. His breath hitched only once, at the line about justice learning to speak human. It wasn't rage that rose up in him. It was something slower, more bitter, a recognition, a mirror. His fingers crumpled the page before he knew it. A guttural sound caught in his throat, somewhere between a curse and a plea. He stood, walked to the corner of the cell, where the toilet bowl gleamed with the sterile precision of daily bleach. He struck a match, lit the corner of the page, and watched as the flame raced toward the fingerprint. It curled, blackened, and fell into the water like a wounded bird. He didn't flush immediately, just stared at it. A grimace carved deep into his jaw. The match burned to his fingers before he dropped it. Only then did he press the flush, as if the action could exorcise the presence on that page. But letters do not burn in silence. They echo. And this one had already been read, reposted, translated, and dissected. Law students in New York annotated it like scripture. Protesters in Minneapolis painted murals inspired by it. Retired officers in Boston held a reading circle where no one spoke afterward for 15 minutes. The fingerprint had become a symbol, a paradoxical scream of dignity without voice. It was etched into T-shirts, graffitied on courthouse walls, and passed between generations like a sacred oath. And no matter how many times Rick tried to picture her, The woman he once thought too invisible to matter. He could no longer frame her as anything other than the one whose silence shook the ground louder than his gun ever had. The ripple was seismic. In law schools, the 7 lines were projected on lecture hall walls, dissected not just for meaning but for method. How a message so spare could cut so deep. Professors quoted it in constitutional theory. Judges scribbled it in the margins of dissenting opinions. A retired Supreme Court justice called it the purest judicial rebuke never spoken inside a courtroom. Still, no one knew the author. And yet, everyone did. The fingerprint was not run through any official database, but the shape, the arch, the slight smudge of ink to the left. Analysts didn't need to confirm what millions already sensed. This letter was written by someone who had once been silent because silence was the only language left to her. Now she had chosen a different dialect, restraint forged into resolve. Some called it a manifesto, others a prayer, but it did not beg. It bled, and in that bleeding it baptized the system it critiqued. The New York Bar Association framed a print of it at their entrance. The National Archive requested the original copy. It was not sent. It remained in the drawer of the same desk where it had first appeared, under lock and key, guarded not by security, but by reverence. There were calls to turn it into a motion, a movement, a mural, but that would cheapen it. The power of the letter was not in what it said. It was what unshackled it. Back in the penitentiary, Rick was pacing. His footfalls echoed off concrete walls like bad memories. The flush hadn't erased it. The smoke hadn't erased it. And the silence in his cell was louder now than any screams he'd once barked at suspects, than any verdict he'd ever relished delivering in the name of a badge he thought invincible. This was different. This was personal, because for the first time, someone had fought him not with volume, not with vengeance, but with absence. And somehow, it was more damning than any accusation ever screamed in his face. He tried to sleep, but his cot may as well have been lined with the fibers of that letter. Every time he blinked, he saw the curve of that inked fingerprint. He heard the phrase again, "Justice learns to speak human." It mocked him. No, it taught him. It dragged him. It reduced him. Elsewhere, think tanks debated the implications. Could silence be policy? Could restraint be revolution? One op-ed in The Atlantic posited that this was the new age of leadership, where volume is weakness and listening is resistance. Meanwhile, young black girls across the country folded photocopies of the letter into their notebooks like talismans. A group of high school students in Detroit memorized it as spoken word and recited it in front of City Hall. Their last line, "Not because I shouted, but because the world finally listened," was met with 2 minutes of unprompted silence. She still hadn't spoken publicly. Not a press conference, not a comment. Her office issued no clarification. Her name was not attached. Yet every TV panel debated her. Every radio host speculated. The letter had no author, but it had a heartbeat, and it matched hers. And one of the more haunting ironies, the fingerprint became the most recognized icon in recent civil discourse. It was tattooed, replicated, and sculpted in steel. A group of former victims of excessive force created a nonprofit under its banner, aiming to teach constitutional rights and silent protest tactics. Their motto, "Change has no decibel level," and all of it, every pixel, every page, every breath of momentum, stemmed from a single folded piece of paper left behind like a fuse. Inside Rick's cell, the lights dimmed at 10. He lay on his back, hands folded across his chest, staring at the ceiling. He thought of what he would say to her if he ever saw her again, what words would breach that wall she'd built. Not of coldness, but of clarity. Would he apologize, justify, break? And deep down, a truth itched behind his teeth. One he refused to say aloud. He didn't hate her for being heard without ever needing to raise her voice, for owning power without having to wield it, for making the world stop and re-listen to what it had learned to ignore, and for reminding everyone, especially him, that silence, when chosen, wasn't the absence of force. It was forced to perfection. He used to call them subjects, as if naming them less than people made them easier to process, easier to pin down. easier to control. But now, as Rick Halston walked through the iron belly of general population, head lowered, jumpsuit the color of defeat, no one mistook him for anything more than just another inmate with a past no one respected and a future no one feared. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed, not because of his presence, but because of what his presence used to mean. Authority, brutality, impunity. But here, those were currencies that no longer held value. The guard didn't even bother announcing him. The steel door buzzed, opened, and slammed shut with the indifference of a machine that had done this 1,000 times before. Rick stood still, waiting for some sense of protocol, but none came. The hallway was lined with eyes, some curious, some cold, none surprised. He was just meat, walking into the grinder now. There was no shield, no badge, no thin blue line. Only the thick line of silence followed him like a second shadow. He shuffled toward his bunk, trying not to let his posture betray the churn in his gut. That same gut he used to trust for instincts, for danger, now twisted not from threat but from realization. There was no uniform here to hide behind, no partner at his six. Every step forward felt like a regression into the very system he once claimed to protect, only now he was inside it for real. Lunch came like a punishment, wrapped in a tray. Cold potatoes, mystery meat, something green that had long forgotten it used to be a vegetable. He sat alone. When the first tray landed next to his, the thud made him flinch. A man twice his size, muscles braided with ink, leaned over, sniffed the food, then looked at Rick and smiled. Not kindly. "Look what we got here," the man said, loud enough for half the hall to hear. "Mr. Quick Process, heard you used to call us all cases back then." The term dripped with venom, distorted into mockery. Rick didn't answer. He kept his eyes down. But silence here was never strength. It was weakness with a bow on top. "You still quick, Rick?" the man said, drawing out the words like a blade across a throat. "Still think you're the law?" Another voice from the table behind added, "Nah, he's just another stat now, another number in the system." Rick forced himself to chew, to swallow, but the meat stuck to his tongue like regret. Then, with a wet splat, a glob of spit landed on his tray, yellowed, thick, and deliberate. He looked up, not in defiance but in disbelief. The man who did it just stared back, calm, almost bored. "You gonna report me, officer?" he asked, sneering the last word like a punchline. Rick stood up, not to fight, but to walk away. The room didn't quiet. It laughed. Not loud, but in hisses and chuckles, the kind that filled walls, the kind that followed you like smoke. He dumped the tray without touching the food. Pride didn't taste as good cold. That night, Rick wrote his first request, a formal petition for transfer. He didn't beg, not outright, but the language was laced with desperation. He cited safety concerns, exposure, prior contact with inmates, anything he thought would buy him distance. He folded it neatly, placed it in the slot, and waited. 2 days later, the response came. It was a single sheet, typed, unsigned. "Your current placement honors the same legal standards you once upheld. No special arrangements required." Rick read it twice, the second time slower, letting the irony peel back his skin. He had invoked the system, and the system had answered, not with a voice, but with his echo. The next morning, he approached the guard desk. It wasn't a planned move, it just happened. Like drowning men sometimes reach for water. The guard, young, fit, and alert, looked up from a clipboard. He didn't flinch. Rick cleared his throat, voice dry as chalk. "Can I talk to the supervisor?" The guard blinked once. "4." Rick hesitated. The word wouldn't come, but when it did, it stumbled out like a stone kicked downhill. "Please." It was the first time he'd said it in years, maybe longer. The weight of it landed heavier than expected. It didn't sting, it sank. The guard, a black man, maybe in his early 30s, didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't even blink in mock surprise. He just nodded once, slowly, like he was cataloging the moment, and then turned away, without a word. Rick stood there, hand still half raised. No answer came. No question was acknowledged. The silence wasn't violent, it was clean, efficient, surgical. It told him exactly what he needed to hear. "You're no one here." Rick walked back to his bunk with the kind of careful steps prisoners learned through instinct, never too fast to seem afraid, never too slow to seem defiant. The floor was scuffed, stained by years of unspoken stories, but he wasn't looking at the ground anymore. He saw everything now. He saw the way conversations stopped as he passed. He saw the flick of fingers tapping against metal, the eyes that never blinked, the tattoos that mapped out histories longer than police files ever could. The walls were heavy with memory, and he had become just another line in someone else's story. That night, a game of dominoes turned into a scuffle 3 cells down. He heard the clang, the shouts, the buzz of the emergency button, but nobody came running. The guards watched from the cameras, waited until it burned out on its own. Rick lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling, muscles stiff with the kind of fear that doesn't scream but sits behind your ribs like a sleeping dog. He realized this place didn't need to beat him. He just needed to let time do its job. When the lights went out, the darkness was different from any he'd known. This wasn't the tactical darkness of operations, or the dim haze of a hungover morning. This was hollow darkness, passive yet absolute. Rick closed his eyes and, for the first time in weeks, didn't dream. His mind didn't wander. It didn't even whisper. Days passed. Then a week. He stopped checking the clock. Meals came, tasted the same, and disappeared. The names and faces around him rotated, but the glares stayed consistent. There was no violence. Not yet. Only the pressure. Only the sense that everyone was waiting. Not for him to break, but for him to admit, to himself and everyone else, that he already had. A letter came. He didn't recognize the handwriting, no return address, just his name and inmate number. Inside, a single page, no words, just a printout of his quote, one he'd said years ago during a precinct interview. "Power is knowing no one will question your decisions." At the bottom, someone had scribbled, "Still true?" He stared at it for a long time before tearing it in half, then again, until it fit inside the tiny toilet bowl beside his bunk. He flushed it, not because he was angry, but because he knew someone was watching, always watching, and he hated the idea that someone still thought they could get to him. That evening, during yard time, he sat alone on a bench near the fence. The sun was dipping low, cutting long shadows through the razor wire. In the corner of his vision, a man approached. Mid-40s, stocky, scarred. Rick tensed. But the man didn't sit, just stopped a few feet away and said, "You remember me?" Rick looked up. "Should I? And you slammed my face into the hood of my car. Said I was moving suspiciously in my damn driveway." There was no rage in his voice. No heat, just a flatness that made Rick feel smaller than the bench he sat on. "I don't remember," Rick said. "That's the thing," the man replied. "You never do." And he walked away. It hit Rick harder than a punch, because it was true. He never did remember. Not the faces, not the names, just the moments he controlled and the ones he erased. But now, each of them was coming back, not in dreams, in flesh, in voices, in quiet confrontations with the past he'd paved over like potholes. Later that night, he looked in the mirror again. Not the shattered one in the cell, but the reflective steel of the sink. He leaned in close. His eyes were bloodshot. His jaw is thinner. And beneath it all, something was shifting. Not guilt. Not yet. But recognition. The start of a new kind of punishment. Memory. The next morning, a new arrival was escorted into the block, young, tall, dreadlocks pulled back tight, eyes sharp as broken glass. Rick didn't react, but the young man stared. Not long, just enough. Enough for Rick to feel that peculiar heat at the back of his neck again. That heat said, "You're not feared anymore, just recognized." Breakfast came. Slopped onto the tray like always. Rick took it in silence, moved to the far table. As he sat, a smear of spit hit the plastic right next to his toast. He looked up. The inmate who'd done it didn't laugh, didn't grin, just returned to his seat like nothing had happened. Rick didn't respond. No words, no movement, not even a twitch. That was worse. because it wasn't about dominance anymore. It was about dismissal. Later, in the counselor's office, Rick filled out a form to request a transfer. He didn't say it out loud, but it was all over his handwriting. Fear, exposure, the need to escape. The counselor didn't flinch. He scanned the form, stapled it, and placed it in a pile. "You'll hear back," he said without looking up. "In about 6 weeks, maybe." Rick waited for something more. Some acknowledgement, some sympathy, but the room had none. Not even air seemed interested in lingering. By the following week, Rick's world had shrunk to 3 routines: eat, avoid, remember. He walked more slowly now. He slept less. When the lights flickered in the hallway, he flinched. When keys jangled too close to his door, he sat up straight. But the worst part wasn't the nerves. It was the knowing that no one here saw him as a former authority figure. He was just another inmate, another number, another cautionary tale. One afternoon, while sweeping the common area, a chore he didn't ask for but was assigned anyway, Rick saw the same guard who handed him his intake packet on day 1. A black man, early 30s, clean uniform, unreadable face. As Rick emptied the dustpan, he dared to mutter, "Please, I just need some space." Away from the guard paused. Not long, just a beat, long enough for silence to stretch. Then he said with a slow nod, "Now you understand what space means when no one gives it to you." He turned and walked off. No malice in his tone, just finality. Rick didn't argue. Couldn't. He stood there, broom in hand, as echoes of old orders came back to mock him. The way he used to bark commands without looking up. The way he used to call people subjects, perps, objects of interest. Funny how quickly language loses its edge when it's turned on you. In the quiet of his bunk that night, Rick took a sheet of notebook paper and started writing. Not a letter, not a complaint. Just a list. Names he remembered, faces that returned to him now like storm clouds after drought. He didn't know what he was going to do with it, but for the first time, he didn't write to report or accuse or condemn. He wrote to remember, and maybe, though he'd never admit it, to apologize, silently, in the only way he still could. By the end of that week, Rick began to count silences, not hours, not days, silences, the moments when no one looked at him, no one spoke his name, no one acknowledged his presence, even when he stood in the middle of the room. That, more than the spit, more than the nicknames, cut him cleanest, the absence of hatred, the void of fear. They used to step back when he walked past, but now they didn't even bother stepping aside. At chow, a tray would slide its way. He'd sit alone, always at the same table, the one closest to the window, not for the light, but because it was the furthest from everyone else. The newer inmates didn't recognize him. He was just another gaunt white man with bags under his eyes and an edge worn dull. But some of the older ones remembered, and they made it a point to never say more than was needed. A few would pass him and whisper things like, "Ain't so tall behind these walls, huh?" Or, "Guess karma wears orange too." He didn't reply, didn't flinch. But inside, something kept crumbling, small, slow, like rust taking a door hinge. He still slept in short bursts, waking at every clink of metal, every distant shout. Once he heard laughter echoing through the corridor, and it paralyzed him. Not because it was close, but because for a second he thought it was his voice, from another life, coming back to mock him. In the exercise yard, where others found escape in sweat and motion, Rick stood still, hands behind his back, eyes scanning fences like they might tell him something the walls wouldn't. A younger inmate jogged past him and bumped his shoulder, hard, deliberate. Rick didn't react. He didn't have the leverage anymore, not in fists, not in power, not in name. So he swallowed the sting and kept his posture upright, like muscle memory hadn't caught up to reality. It was during one of those afternoons that Rick saw the notice board in the common area. A laminated flyer, stapled to the cork, tilted slightly. It was a printout of an op-ed from a civil liberties magazine, featuring a quote pulled from a viral case, his case. It read, "Justice is not about vengeance. It's about removing power from those who've abused it." Underneath, a blurry still from the video, Rick's face, mid-sneer, his gun drawn, shadow cast across the forehead of the woman he once tried to belittle. Someone had scribbled next to it in pen, "Still smiling, officer?" He stared at it for nearly 5 minutes, not moving, just staring. No one stopped him. No one joined him. The silence felt different now, like a museum silence, where shame hung in frames. When he finally stepped back, he caught his reflection in the plexiglass covering the board. Hollow eyes, slack jaw, a twitch at the temple he couldn't suppress anymore. He turned and walked away. That night, as he lay on the thin mattress, Rick tried to recall what his voice used to sound like in command. Not the words, the tone, the timbre, the way it used to fill a room. He couldn't. It came back broken, like a song out of tune. He rolled over, pulled the blanket to his chin, and whispered to the ceiling, "I used to matter." No one answered. The following morning, during the laundry detail, Rick found himself folding uniforms next to a man who hadn't spoken a word to him since intake. The man, middle-aged, heavily tattooed, watched Rick fumble with a bedsheet. Then, without looking up, he said, "You keep folding like that? They'll think you've never made a bed in your life." Rick glanced over. "I have. I just forgot." "How?" The man smirked. Not friendly, not cruel, just tired. "Don't worry. In here, you'll have time to remember everything you tried to forget." That landed harder than any punch would have. Later that day, Rick checked the mail list again. Still no reply on the transfer request. He knew it wouldn't come. Not the way he wanted. The system didn't bend for people like him anymore. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same red tape he once wielded like a sword now tied knots around his wrists. He had become a case number in someone else's backlog, an inconvenience, a reminder, a file to be closed. Walking back to his cell, he passed the bulletin board again. The flyer had been updated. Now, in place of his sneer, was a photo of the woman he once dismissed. White shirt, gold slacks, standing tall, eyes forward. No caption needed, just the image, bold and resolute. Someone had written beneath it, "Some people wear uniforms, others become the law." Rick stared, long enough for the guard behind him to mutter, "Move it." He did, but slowly, not out of defiance, out of something else, something resembling grief. That night he didn't write, didn't list names. He just lay still and whispered the word "please" again, not to anyone, just to himself. The days began to blur. Rick no longer counted meals or shifts. He counted acts of invisibility. How many times he passed another inmate and got nothing. No glance, no slur, not even contempt. Just absence. It was worse than hate. Hate still acknowledged you existed. This was erasure. A week after the updated flyer, Rick received a brown envelope marked "Return to Sender." It was the second transfer appeal he'd written. Same result. This time, though, someone had scribbled a note on the back of the envelope in bold block letters. "We are respecting your rights, Mr. Halston, especially the ones you ignored." He didn't read it twice. He tore it once, slowly, methodically, corner to corner, until it became confetti, then flushed the pieces down the toilet without watching them swirl. His bunkmate, a quiet man who rarely spoke, raised an eyebrow and said, "They answer louder when you've got nothing left to say, huh?" Rick didn't reply. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, staring at his hands, remembering how they used to hold authority like it was a weapon. Now they only held paper and failure. That night, the prison hosted a mandatory orientation for new inmates. Rick wasn't part of it, but as the line of fresh arrivals shuffled past his block, he stood against the wall and watched. Some were young, eyes darting like prey. Others walked with practiced shoulders, tattooed narratives of other sins and older sins. One of them, tall, brown-skinned, calm in the chaos, caught Rick's gaze for a second too long. "You used to be Rick, right?" he asked. Rick nodded, unsure if the man was mocking him or just curious. The man didn't laugh. He just shook his head and kept moving. "You had your shot, man," he said over his shoulder. "Hope you know how to breathe in someone else's story now." Rick didn't follow. He didn't shout back. He returned to his cell and shut the door before the guard could bark at him. That night, his dreams turned strange. Not violent, not loud, just empty. He wandered through endless hallways, lined with mirrors that refused to reflect him. Every time he tried to scream, he woke up with his jaw clenched and the taste of rust in his mouth. The next morning, Rick went to the infirmary, not because he was sick, but because he needed silence. The nurse, a stocky man with graying sideburns, barely looked up when Rick signed in. "Vitals," he said, tapping a clipboard. Rick sat. "Blood pressure cuff, thermometer, pulse oximeter. You good?" the nurse muttered, about to move on. Rick stayed seated. The nurse raised an eyebrow. "Something else?" Rick stared at the floor. "I'm not asking for anything," he said finally, voice low. "I just needed to sit somewhere that didn't look like punishment." The nurse didn't smile, didn't offer sympathy. He just nodded once and walked away. That moment, ordinary, medical, irrelevant, was the closest Rick had come to grace in weeks. Not kindness, not forgiveness, just a place to sit without being reminded who he wasn't anymore. Later, during rec time, he didn't go outside. Instead, he stood near the library, staring through the wire glass window at rows of untouched books. He didn't know why. He didn't want to read. He wasn't looking for redemption. But something about the stillness behind the door felt clean, like a place where names didn't echo so loudly. A guard passed and said, "You need something, Halston?" Rick shook his head. "Just looking. Nothing in there you didn't already ignore," the guard replied and walked off. Rick didn't react. He just turned and leaned against the wall, breathing through his nose, trying not to let the comment stick. But it did. It stuck like everything else, layer after layer of unspoken verdicts that weren't delivered by courts, but by the unrelenting indifference of those who remembered. Back in his cell that night, Rick wrote again. Not a request, not a complaint, just a list. A list of every name he could remember. People he'd stopped, cuffed, silenced, and accused. No last names, just first names and moments. Jamal, rainy day, 7th and Broad. Clara, broken taillight. Didn't cry. Andre, asked for a badge number. I laughed. He filled 3 pages, folded them, didn't know what to do with them. Left them under his mattress. When lights out came, he didn't move. He lay still, eyes open in the dark, the soft whir of the ceiling vent the only sound he could trust not to betray him. In that hour before sleep took him, he thought not of escape or appeal or even regret. He thought of something simpler, colder, the sharp clarity of knowing no one wanted him anywhere, and how, for the first time, he understood what that meant, not as punishment, but as consequence. And in that silence, Rick Halston finally became what he feared most. Not infamous, not hated, not even remembered, just small, just human, just another man behind the door. Rick leaned forward, elbows braced against the rusted edge of the prison's sink, breath clouding the crack-laced mirror that stared back like a cracked memory. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting jerky shadows that made his reflection twitch like it was trying to escape. The mirror, once a tool of vanity in his previous world, now sliced his image down the center with a diagonal scar, sketched permanently into the glass, just as time had etched itself into the hollows of his cheek. He squinted. The face staring back at him was alien, sallow, sunken, strung out by weeks of sleepless guilt and the relentless grind of confinement. Skin clung too tightly to bones, and his eyes, once weapons of authority, now looked unsure, blurred at the edges. He tilted his head, like testing if the mirror would return something different from another angle. It didn't. Half of his face was lit by cold, white light, the other lost in the fractured distortion of the crack, as if the man he used to be was hiding in the shadows, refusing to own up to what was left. He tried to summon the smirk he wore like armor during patrols. That smirk, the one that dismissed questions, silenced protest, declared dominion, now surfaced as a crooked, pathetic twitch. His lip curled, but not in arrogance. It quivered. The more he stared, the more it felt like someone else behind the glass was mocking him, mimicking poorly, not recognizing the timing, not knowing how that smirk was supposed to land. He thought of the woman, her wrist under his boot, the warmth of blood as it met concrete. The way she didn't flinch when his voice dripped with contempt. That image didn't just haunt him, it embedded in the glass, morphing with every blink into a flicker behind his shoulder. He leaned closer. There, again, the faintest flick of her braid in the corner of the cracked pane. His chest tightened. He slammed his pan flat against the mirror, trying to shove the ghost back through. The jolt sent a crackling jangle down his arm. The glass didn't break. It didn't need to. It had already won. Then, almost without thinking, he clenched his fist and drove it into the center of the crack. A dull thud echoed, more flesh than impact. The mirror didn't shatter. It wasn't cinematic, it was real. The kind of real where skin splits slowly and deliberately, where blood blooms in modest defiance. Crimson smeared across the cold glass like war paint, tracing over his reflection, warping it further. He stood there, knuckles leaking, eyes fixed. No alarm sounded. No guard rushed in. No inmates jeered. Silence, as if the building itself refused to acknowledge his outburst. The pain wasn't sharp. It was almost kind, a strange, numb acceptance. Rick watched the blood drip down, trying to read something in the way it curved, the paths it chose. None spelled forgiveness. None spelled home. He didn't bandage the hand, didn't even turn from the mirror. He just stood there. Hours, maybe, until the light flickered again, drawing a blink, and reminded him the world was still turning without him. Outside the door, footsteps echoed down the hall. Measured, indifferent. He expected someone to check in, to bark a warning. No one came. They'd stopped caring. That was the worst part. He was no longer feared. He was no longer hated. He was irrelevant. A relic no longer sharp enough to harm, not even himself. He lowered his hand, smeared a blood arc across his cheek in a daze, as if to reattach himself to something visceral, but the warmth faded quickly. The mirror absorbed everything. It held his gaze, unblinking, whispering back nothing. Not hate, not pity, just absence. Rick backed away slowly, the way one does when realizing they've walked into a memory they shouldn't have revisited. One foot, then another. He glanced once more before stepping through the threshold. The man in the mirror stayed behind, forever cracked, always watching. He didn't look back again. The screen flickered to life in the training hall of the National Law Enforcement Academy. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead was drowned out by the silence of anticipation. Every trainee, dressed in crisp blue, sat still, not out of discipline but from the weight of what they were about to witness. The opening slide cut across the projector like a verdict, a still image of Rick Halston, wrists shackled in front of a federal courthouse, his mouth twisted mid-scream, eyes wide with disbelief. Beneath the image, in stark white text, a caption. This man once lectured on justice. A few cadets exchanged uneasy glances, others simply stared. The instructor, a woman with short-cropped hair and decades of field lines creasing her face, didn't speak. She only clicked the next slide. No preamble, no lecture notes. The lesson was the silence itself. This was the Academy's first formal session on ethics and enforcement, a course newly mandated in the wake of Rick's public downfall. The school had made a choice to place failure on the front row, not sweep it under the rug. And Rick Halston, once their golden lecturer on tactics and law, now stood at the center of their curriculum, not as a mentor, but as a monument to moral erosion. The screen flashed again. Video, no narration, just grainy footage of Rick on patrol, barking orders, grabbing suspects, smirking as he issued threats. The audio crackled but still carried venom. "I don't need a warrant," he had once bragged to a bystander. "Just a reason. And right now I don't even need that." The footage paused. The room was still as marble. Then, without introduction, a letter appeared on the screen. A quote in cursive font. "I don't teach it, I love it." Below the words, the signature line was left blank, but everyone knew it was the federal chief. The woman Rick had once called help without knowing who she was. She had declined the Academy's invitation to speak. No spotlight, no lectureship, just one sentence sent in ink. The instructor finally spoke. "Read it again," she said, voice dry like gravel. They did. I don't teach it. I love it. No debate followed. No student dared challenge what had been laid bare. At the back of the training hall, mounted high in a corner, a TV flickered with the same broadcast. This screen, however, didn't face cadets. It sat bolted to the wall of a federal prison. The camera zoomed in slightly. On the other side of the screen sat Rick Halston. His prison jumpsuit was wrinkled, his hands clasped too tightly in his lap. A small vein throbbed at his temple. His face was leaner now, jaw hollowed, cheeks slightly sunken. But what hit hardest wasn't the image, it was the sound. It was hearing his own words played back in a context that made him look like a fraud and a fool. They were using him. He was the case study, he was the warning. Rick leaned forward, eyes fixed on the cadet who stood in the front row, now reciting one of Rick's past tirades, verbatim, word for word, as an example of what not to emulate. Compliance isn't about rights, the young man read aloud, his voice tight, his discomfort palpable. It's about survival, and I'm the one who decides what that means. Rick flinched. That line had once made his colleagues chuckle. He had dropped it like a mic bomb after a raid, but now, spoken by a stranger, it was poison spilling back into his throat. The next cadet stood, his voice stronger, more confrontational. Quote, "If someone wants to make this about race, then they better not be the one giving me attitude with a badge." He paused, eyes scanning the room. "You all remember when that one surfaced, right?" Nods rippled through the crowd. Rick sat back, shoulders slumped. The final quote came from a girl, small, composed, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much for someone her age. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize, she just read. You live long enough behind the badge, you stop seeing people, you see categories. Silence again. The instructor clicked off the projector. "I don't care if you're the fastest shot, the best brawler, or the smartest tactician," she said. "If you forget that every single person is a person first, you'll become this." She gestured to the blank screen where Rick's image had just been. "You'll lose your badge, your legacy, your name, and maybe you deserve to." Rick didn't hear the rest. His hand moved to his forehead. He rubbed the space between his eyes. The headache had become constant lately, like something grinding at the inside of his skull. It wasn't from noise. It was from the echo. He stood abruptly from the prison common area, drawing a glance from a guard nearby. "Back to your cell, Halston?" the guard asked, not unkindly. Rick didn't answer. He just walked. He no longer strutted, no swagger, no curse under his breath. He walked like a man whose spine had been hollowed out. Behind him, the TV screen lingered on one final quote. This time not from Rick. This one belonged to the woman he had tried to humiliate. It read, "Some names are written in ink, others are written in consequence." Rick's cell was colder than usual. The radiator wheezed, but no warmth came. He sat on the edge of the thin mattress, arms folded over his knees, watching the cinder block wall as though it were still flickering with the broadcast. But the screen was behind him now. The screen could be shut off. The truth couldn't. His lips moved, silently mouthing a phrase he couldn't quite finish. Each time he got halfway through, the words dried up in his throat. There was nothing noble in finishing a sentence that started with, "I was." What followed didn't matter anymore. Across town, in the Academy's ethics department, cadets were writing reflections, not essays for grades. There were no grades for integrity. This was about legacy, about recording where they stood after seeing where others had fallen. Some wrote furiously. Others just sat, pens idle, eyes still locked on the ghost of Rick's image. Meanwhile, the faculty reviewed the anonymous letter again. The one from the chief, the one who had refused to speak. She hadn't declined to avoid confrontation. She had declined because teaching required distance, and she'd already walked through the fire. Her words lived where rules couldn't reach. She didn't theorize justice. She became the proof of it. Rick sat with his back to the door, head against the concrete. For a long moment, he didn't move, until the intercom crackled with a metallic voice. "Halston, you got mail." He didn't expect any. Nobody wrote him anymore, not after the trial, not after his father had denounced him on national television, not after the department released his full personnel file. Yet here it was. A plain white envelope slid under the cell door like a ghost's offering. He picked it up slowly, no return address. Inside was a single printed image, the same classroom slide, the one that had introduced the ethics lecture. His photo, handcuffed, and beneath it someone had scrawled in black pen, "Still think silence makes you powerful?" He crumpled the paper, but not in rage. He crumpled it with trembling hands, unable to stop the way his fingers shook. It wasn't fury anymore. It was something colder, something closer to grief. In the academy, the instructor resumed her place at the front. She cleared her throat once, no theatrics, and said, "We're not here to shame a man. We're here to see what happens when power replaces purpose." She tapped the screen again. A quote appeared from an old civil rights hearing, decades before any of them were born. "You can break a system by following its rules without conscience. Now," she continued, "let's talk about what conscience costs." Back in his cell, Rick stared at the metal sink. The faucet dripped, tick by tick, echoing across the stone like a metronome to a song he could no longer play. He remembered how it used to feel, walking into a room with the badge on his chest, the way people stood straighter, the way silence bent to his presence. Now, no one stood when he entered. No one saluted. His name didn't open doors. It shut them. He stood and walked to the small mirror, the one bolted above the sink. Not glass, just polished metal, dulled from years of use. It reflected no detail, only shapes, shadows. He leaned in and saw what he was now, a blur, a whisper of a man who once shouted commands. A knock came at the door. It wasn't a guard, it was another inmate, young, lean, face tattooed with too many fights. The kid looked him up and down, then smirked. "Are you the guy from the TV?" he asked. Rick didn't respond. The kid chuckled. "Thought so. You look taller on screen." Then he walked away. Rick didn't follow. He didn't rise to it. He just sat again, not out of defeat, but because rising would require a reason, and he was out of those now. At the academy, the lecture closed with a final slide. A black screen, white text, no name. "If honor depends on law, then it was never yours to begin with." The cadets stood, not because they were told to, but because they understood they had just witnessed something irreversible. A career reduced to a case study. A man once draped in authority is now repurposed into a warning. Rick closed his eyes. He remembered the badge, the shine, the way it felt in his palm before he pinned it on, like armor, like proof. Now he knew it was neither. The next morning, no one knocked on Rick's door. No tray slid across the floor, no cell inspection, no voice barking orders from the end of the corridor. The silence was not a reprieve, it was a verdict, invisible but complete. The system had not forgotten him, it had moved on. Rick remained seated, his legs numb, back curved forward in a posture that once would have disgusted him in others. His uniform was wrinkled, his hair uncombed. Even the small rituals, brushing teeth, folding blankets, felt pointless now. He had lost the mirror, but worse, he had lost the audience. What is identity when stripped of attention? Across town, another classroom took shape. A visiting professor, once an expert in criminal profiling, was brought in to expand the lecture. His first words were simple. Power doesn't corrupt. Power reveals. He clicked the projector on, and instead of Rick's face, a split screen showed two images. On one side, a younger Rick giving a police seminar on control and escalation. On the other, his mugshot, eyes blurred, jaw tight, neck tense from restraint. "Both images are real," the professor said, "and both lived in the same man. Inmate 6721, Rick Halston." Didn't know about the new lecture, but he felt it, the shift, the recalibration of a legacy. When a guard finally did appear, it was for a routine count. The man barely glanced at Rick, murmured a number, and moved on. No acknowledgement, no disdain either. just absence. Rick wasn't worth hating anymore. He was institutional furniture. He existed, but only as background. That same afternoon, a student at the academy raised her hand. She had been silent most of the semester, always watching, always listening. Now she stood and read aloud one of Rick's statements, recorded years ago in a wrongful search case. He said, she quoted, "If someone looks like a threat, that's enough for me." She paused, letting the words hang, then asked, "What does it mean when fear becomes the standard?" The room didn't answer. It didn't have to. The weight of the question was the lesson. Back in his cell, Rick began to write, not for an appeal, not for redemption. It was unclear why, exactly, but he wrote. A yellowed sheet of commissary paper, lines faded, corners soft, the pen scratched weakly, struggling across the page like it, too, wanted to escape. He wrote his name, then crossed it out, wrote it again, crossed it again. After 10 attempts, the page looked like a battlefield of identities, each version scratched out, rejected, abandoned. At the bottom, in trembling script, he wrote 2 words. "Who am?" He didn't finish. The paper curled as he dropped it. The instructor at the academy pulled up one last file. Not a video, not audio. A photograph, grainy, from an old investigation report. Rick standing over a suspect. Arm raised, expression unreadable. It had been buried in the archives. Now it opened class discussion. "What emotions do you see?" the professor asked. "Control," said one cadet. "Anger," said another. "No," whispered a third. "Fear." That word lingered. It made the others shift in their seats. It made the image on the screen change. No longer a man in control, but a man terrified of losing it. And somewhere inside a prison, Rick closed his eyes and saw the same photo, etched into his mind, not because it reminded him of power, but because it no longer did. That evening, the police academy wrapped the lecture with a simple exercise. Students were handed blank sheets of paper and told to write down what they believed honor meant, without citing law, rank, or rules. Only the human definition, stripped bare. The room went quiet. Pens moved slowly. A few hesitated. A few stared into space, as if waiting for something deeper to rise. The instructor watched them, then turned to the screen where the final quote lingered in bold white font on black. "I don't teach it, I love it." Outside the classroom, pinned on the wall, was a blown-up image of a woman walking past the ruins of an old precinct building, her silhouette framed by light, her head unbowed, her steps even. No name on the plaque, no caption, just the image. Rick saw it later that night. A small feature in the prison newsletter had included a note about the Academy's ethics initiative. The photo was there, and underneath a quote from one of the cadets. "The system doesn't define us. We define it by what we refuse to ignore." He stared at it, his lips dry, hands trembling slightly. The newsletter slipped from his fingers onto the cement floor and lay there, face up, mocking. When the prison lights flicked off for the night, Rick remained seated on the lower bunk. The faint hum of fluorescent fixtures above him buzzed like a question without punctuation. He blinked, slow and deliberate, his breathing as shallow. Somewhere in the dark, a new recruit read her classmate's words one last time before bed, folded the paper into thirds, tucked it into her locker, and whispered, "He was a warning, she is a compass." That was the night the lecture became legend. Not because of the images, not because of the man, but because of how deeply silence can speak when the world finally learns to listen. Rick didn't sleep. He sat in that shadowed cell, no longer planning, protesting, pretending. The law he had wielded like a blade had turned to reflection, and what stared back was a version of himself no longer feared, no longer followed, just observed. At sunrise, a guard passed by and paused for a second longer than usual. Rick didn't move, didn't blink. The guard said nothing, but the silence between them was no longer tension, it was transition. And so, in a prison where honor once meant control, and law once meant immunity, there now stood a man without title, without shield, without excuse, just the faint outline of what happens when power forgets humility. He walked alone, No convoy, no entourage, no press trailing behind, just the sound of gravel shifting under her boots as she moved forward through a field of muted color and forgotten battles. Behind her, the ruins of what used to be a police precinct stood like bones picked clean by time. Walls scorched, letters peeled, the emblem above the door melted half off. The wind didn't whistle, it carried dust in silence. A camera lens caught her mid-step, her white shirt pressed crisp against her back, her golden pants catching just enough light to burn their shape into the frame. She didn't pose, she didn't slow, she didn't know, or didn't care, that a photographer had found her. Her eyes were forward, chin level, arms at her sides like she was part of the landscape, not above it. That image exploded into the public bloodstream within hours. No watermark, no caption, just her silhouette walking through a space that used to dictate authority. One journalist wrote, "She didn't speak, but every line of that photo screams." Another followed, "We don't know her name, but we've all seen her now." And a third, more poetic, printed on the front page of a major national outlet, "This is what standing looks like when words get in the way." Somewhere in a prison not far away, the nightly news flickered across a tiny mounted screen. Rick Halston sat beneath it, his elbows on his knees, head tilted back just enough to watch without craning. The story needed no anchor. The image did all the talking. That same photo now blown up, framed by networks, magazines, timelines, and graffiti. His mouth curled upward, not into a smile, but something sour, more hollow. "She's a damn icon now," he muttered, mostly to himself, but loud enough to echo. "And I used to call her a maid." No one answered. The cell block around him was quiet. A few seconds later, the news segment switched to something else. A budget meeting, a speech, or noise, but Rick didn't look away. He still saw her, not the woman, the outline. The shape burned into the boneyard of everything he used to believe untouchable. On the outside, print shops rolled out posters at record speed. "Stand without words," they read, in thick black letters beneath her image. Street corners bored them. Cafes taped them in windows. Protesters held them like shields. Even some officers quietly folded them into their lockers like sacred scripts. Not out of rebellion, out of recognition. No statement was released, no press conference, no social media. The woman herself had not spoken. She hadn't needed to. One channel replayed footage from earlier that year. Rick, smug, walking away from a press swarm after a justified traffic stop gone wrong. The clip ended. Then came the image again. Her back to the camera, her shadow stretched long across cracked pavement. The message was clear. One face had talked endlessly. The other had said nothing, and been heard more loudly. Back in his cell, Rick stood, moved slowly toward the mirror he'd once punched, its crack now spidered wider, glass half opaque. He looked at himself, then leaned so his eye aligned with one splintered sliver. In that fragment, he saw her image, faint, burned into memory, the color of her pants, the straightness of her spine, the refusal to look back. He whispered. She never even raised her voice. The guard making rounds didn't stop at his door, didn't ask if he was okay. No one did anymore. She had stolen his legacy without lifting a hand. She didn't rebut. She didn't correct. She became something bigger than the debate. Rick turned away from the mirror, sat back down, picked at the hem of his sleeve with slow, unconscious fingers. What do you do when your worst moment becomes someone else's symbol? What's left when your insult becomes a rally cry? The photo lived longer than outrage. It became art. A mural was painted across the west side of the city, 3 stories tall. Her back, her stride, the sun halo just behind her head. Above it, the same 6 words, "Stand without words." No one tagged it, no one defaced it, no one dared. Reporters speculated. Who is she? Why hasn't she come forward? What is she waiting for? But the more they asked, the more the silence worked. It deepened the power. expanded the myth. She was no longer one woman. She was all of them who had been dismissed, mislabeled, and ignored. She was every time someone had been told, "You don't belong here," didn't answer, but stayed anyway. Rick watched that mural on the news again a week later. Someone had filmed a group of students standing beneath it. Fists to their hearts, no chance, just stillness. And in that stillness, Rick finally saw the mirror flipped. He had been noisy. She had been signaling. He chuckled once, quietly. They don't even need my name anymore. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something twist, not just in his chest, but in the part of him that used to think consequence was always negotiable. It wasn't pain. It wasn't pride. It was the absence of both, a vacuum where meaning used to be. Back on the outside, someone printed the photo on the cover of a book about modern justice reform. No credit given, none needed. The image belonged to the people now. Her stride had become a sentence no courtroom could overrule. No one knew where she was, but the world had stopped needing to, because she had already said what she needed to, without saying a word. There was a silence more thunderous than applause when the wall changed. The Hall of Valor, once the pride of a small precinct tucked between cornfields and rusted overpasses, had always worn its reverence loud. Engraved names, plaques polished weekly, and under a glass dome, the faces of those the town had once called heroes. Rick Halston's name had been there for years, carved in gold just beneath a framed commendation for exceptional service in high-pressure conditions. It had survived 3 renovations, 4 chiefs of police, and more than one scandal, until that morning. The sun was barely lifting through the haze when the crew arrived. No announcements. No reporters, no ceremony, just a single man, gray at the temples, uniform worn but still neat, a retired officer once assigned to Rick's unit. He approached the wall with a quiet intensity, carrying a toolbox and a folded cloth. He didn't speak. He didn't glance around. His hands, though aged, moved with certainty. He placed the cloth beneath the plaque, unscrewed the bolts one by one, each motion deliberate. The wall did not resist. When the nameplate finally slid free, it left behind a rectangular void, slightly darker than the brick around it, an absence that screamed louder than any headline. In place of the name, a temporary board was drilled in. It bore no insignia, no signature, just a stark, sandblasted phrase, "Not all who are honored deserve to be." A breeze rolled through the town square, as if to carry the words into every cracked window and quiet home. No crowd had gathered, no applause followed, but someone, somewhere, would whisper it to someone else before nightfall, and soon the silence would echo louder than shouts. The image, of course, didn't stay local for long. A teenager walking her dog paused, snapped a photo, and posted it online with the caption, "Guess who's not on the wall anymore?" The post exploded. Thousands shared, liked, and added their edits. Memes emerged overnight, comparing the before and after shots, one overlaying Rick's smug smile from a former department press conference atop the black void where his name used to be. Another added a twist. The words, "erased by his echo," floating in dripping font beneath the blank board. Meanwhile, in the penitentiary 3 states away, Rick heard the news not from a guard or visitor, but from a staticky AM radio some cellmate had tuned in by accident. The segment was short, a 30-second blurb tucked between weather updates and a notice about a local fundraiser. Rick Halston's name has officially been removed from the Wall of Valor in his former precinct following national backlash, the voice said. Rick looked up from his cot. The name, his name, said flatly, clinically, stripped of tone, stung more than a shouted insult. He sat up slowly, eyes narrowing, then stood and walked over to the stained concrete wall. In a swift, juvenile act of anger, masked as defiance, he spat at it, watched the dribble run down to the floor, then turned away, jaw tight. No one in the cell block reacted. They didn't mock him, didn't nod in recognition. They simply didn't care. To them, he wasn't the man whose name once stood in gold. He was just another inmate, another bitter former badge clinging to a memory no one else wanted to share. He might have once commanded silence with a look, but now silence owned him. Back at the precinct, the wall didn't look emptier. It looked honest. Officers passed it on their way in, glancing with a mix of reflection and relief. Some paused. None touched it. There was a collective agreement, unspoken but unanimous, that the space where Rick's name once gleamed should never be filled again. It would remain a scar, a reminder. One recruit, fresh from the academy, whispered to her partner as they passed by, "Who was Rick Halston?" The partner, a veteran with 2 decades behind the badge, didn't slow his step. "No one," he said. "Not anymore." The prison phone booth was scratched and yellowed from years of use, its plastic edges worn soft by desperate fingers. Rick stood before it, holding the receiver like it was something foreign, fragile, almost holy. A laminated instruction sheet taped above the dial glared back at him. "You get 60 seconds. Use them wisely." Beneath that, a smaller warning in red: "All calls are recorded." He didn't care about the recording. He cared about the silence that might follow if she didn't answer. He hadn't said her name in weeks. He didn't know if he deserved to anymore. He pressed the number with a trembling finger. Each beep felt heavier than the last. The phone rang. Once, twice, then a click. Static. And then breathing. He knew that breath. It didn't say anything. It didn't need to. Rick exhaled, tried to speak, choked, and then forced it out. I don't know how to say this." The silence didn't move. She didn't help him. "I thought I had it right back then." Still nothing. No shift, no sigh, no judgment, just a wall of listening he could not climb. "I was wrong from the beginning." That was 3 sentences. Each felt like an avalanche dropped into a canyon where only echoes came back. He could hear the timer ticking in his head, feel the 60-second blade lowering. He swallowed. The line went dead. She had hung up. Not at 60 seconds. Not at a convenient narrative beat. She had hung up the moment she chose. Because now she controlled the frame, the timing, the air. Rick froze. The receiver went limp in his hand. The line buzzed softly but brutally in his ear. He didn't move, couldn't, and when his body caught up with reality, he collapsed onto the metal bench beside the phone, arms draped over the table like a marionette with its strings cut. He didn't try again, didn't dial, didn't ask for more minutes. Instead, he sat there, staring at the keypad. The numbers might as well have been symbols in a foreign language. What had once been his voice, sharp, commanding, unstoppable, was now reduced to a stuttered confession in a booth that smelled like bleach and rust. And she stood in a different space, not a courtroom, not a press conference, but her own office, quiet and spare, where the morning sun bled softly through the blinds. The phone still sat in her hand. She hadn't moved since hanging up. Her thumb hovered above the keypad again, but not to read. Instead, she reached for a second line. Her finger punched in a number she had memorized long ago but never used. The dial tone hummed twice. Then a professional voice answered. "Office of the Attorney General." She didn't give her name, didn't ask to be transferred. She simply said, with the kind of steel only born in fire, "I'm ready to take on additional reform assignments." The line paused. Then, "Understood. We'll be in touch." Click. She set the phone down and stood for a long moment. No expression on her face. No breath of pride. Her reflection in the glass caught her profile for a second. The face of a woman who had been called everything from maid to mistake, now giving orders without ever raising her voice. Back in prison, Rick hadn't moved. His fingers traced the curve of the handset like it was a relic. He imagined her still listening on the other end, but she wasn't. She had listened. That was all. And it had undone him more thoroughly than any shouted rebuke. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly powerless. Not just to lose status or name, but to be denied the dignity of reply. She had given him that final grace, the chance to speak, and then denied him the illusion that words alone could ever be enough. It wasn't rejection. It was precision. It was the world folding itself back to justice, one measured breath at a time. The second time she crossed those railroad tracks, there were no voices, no boots hitting gravel, no shouting from behind a badge, just wind, just the metallic hum of rails in the heat. just her shadow falling clean across the very line where her wrists had once been bound. She wore the same white shirt, the same mustard yellow pants. The sun caught the fabric and turned it gold. Her pace was steady, not slow, not hurried. When she reached the center of the track, she stopped. 3 seconds exactly. She tilted her head upward, eyes narrowing at the sky, as if asking the sun if it remembered. Then she took one breath and walked on. No police officer blocked her this time. No challenge barked through clenched teeth. A patrol car did pass quietly, respectfully. The vehicle slowed near the crossing, the window lowered, and from inside an officer leaned slightly forward. He didn't speak. He didn't scan her clothes. He didn't ask questions. He just lowered his head once, briefly, then the car rolled on, swallowed by the light. From a television mounted in the corner of a prison rec room, the scene played with no commentary, no music, no voiceover, just footage, muted, from a local news drone that had captured her solitary walk from a distance. Rick sat watching, eyes locked on the screen. He didn't blink, didn't curse, he simply watched. The frame showed her figure, impossibly small in the wide emptiness of the field, moving across the tracks as if time had folded, as if the world had finally remembered the moment it should have chosen differently, and was now letting her rewrite it. She didn't look back. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. The symbolism was built in. The white, once purity, now resistance. The yellow, once mocked, now unmistakable defiance. She had returned to the site of her humiliation not as a ghost of the past, but as the architect of its correction. She stepped precisely over the tracks that once cut into her spine with gravel and cold steel, and this time they parted before her like silence before a storm. Cameras caught it, but she didn't pose, she didn't perform, she didn't speak to anyone. She crossed the frame the way truth moved, quietly, irrefutable, and uninvited. The town watched, the country watched, but she didn't care who was looking. What mattered was the act. What mattered was that no one tried to stop her. And what mattered most, that the same image, her white shirt, her yellow pants, the long line of railroad steel beneath her boots, played back into the eyes of the very man who once pressed a gun to her forehead and called her a joke. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Because what could he say? Some shifts don't happen in courtrooms or news cycles. They happen in the long, terrible quiet of someone walking exactly where they were once crushed and leaving footprints instead of wounds. The stage was draped in navy blue and lit with a halo of white that glinted off the microphones. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't even a victory lap. It was a reckoning made formal, a moment where policy and pain were finally seated at the same table. The National Reform Summit on Law Enforcement packed the auditorium to the last row. Elected officials, veteran officers, activists, and law students. They all stood in silence when the announcer stepped up to the podium. "Our next speaker," the voice echoed, "is not with us tonight, but her words are." A girl stepped forward. No older than 16, skin rich like molasses, hair in tight coils pulled into a sharp ponytail. She unfolded a sheet of paper and steadied herself. No teleprompter, no warm-up, just the truth, raw on the page. She read. Her voice was clear, but the room held its breath as if each syllable carried a weight measured in years, not seconds. I was never interested in being the voice of the wounded. I didn't want a podium carved from someone else's brutality. I didn't want to speak just because I had once been silenced. But silence, I learned, can be sharper than outrage. Rick heard this from a small radio perched near the barred window of his cell. The frequency crackled, but the words sliced through. You don't have to shout to dismantle a wall. Sometimes all you need is to prove it was never load-bearing. In the room, people didn't nod, they didn't whisper, they just listened. And in that, the essay expanded, filling each corner with the sound of someone who had learned power not by holding it, but by refusing to give it away. I send these words today not because I seek acknowledgement, but because I know someone else, somewhere, is being told they don't belong. I send this because when I stood on a railroad track, dignity wasn't granted to me. I carried it in, and I left it there, planted, unshaken. Applause didn't erupt. It emerged, slow, rising, cascading like a tide finally pulled in by gravity. Not everyone knew her name. Not everyone needed to. Her words had done what names couldn't. Rick didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He didn't even clench his jaw. He sat, still, with wind curling through the rusted bars, and stared at the slice of sky just beyond reach. And still the girl read. I am not a symbol. I am not the echo of injustice. I am not here because I was broken. I am here because the system cracked and tried to convince me it was my fault. It wasn't, and it never will be. The hall rose to their feet, but the spotlight didn't shift. It stayed fixed on the podium, on the words, on the void the writer had chosen to leave behind, not as absence, but as power. I don't ask you to remember my face. I ask you to remember the structure that allowed a man to see yellow pants and call them offensive. I ask you to dismantle that, stone by stone. And that was it. No sign-off, no name, just a fold of paper set back down. The echo lasted longer than the voice, and in a cell hundreds of miles away, a man who once defined the rules of engagement sat in silence, listening to a world no longer quoting him. And it moved on, not past him, but through him. The camera did not pan in with urgency. It hovered, distant, deliberate, like a final breath held too long. The precinct stood unchanged from the outside. Brick faded, windows clouded, the kind of building where history clung to every scuff mark on the floor. But this morning there was no ceremony, no line of officers saluting, no press conference staged with flags and promise. There was only the front door creaking open and one woman stepping into the daylight. She wore no uniform, just a plain white shirt, pressed sharp, and those same yellow pants that once marked her as a target. They didn't flash now, they burned. Every step echoed without applause, but with something deeper. Finality. On her desk inside, now empty, sat one object, a badge dulled with age, its shine long worn down. Beside it, a handwritten note. 7 words. I don't need recognition. I need reform. The room she left behind had no witnesses, no speech, no closure. But the silence was intentional, like punctuation. It didn't ask for attention. It declared an ending. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Rick sat at the plastic table in the common area of Block E. The TV above flickered with static, a news anchor's voice slicing through cafeteria noise with practiced calm. In today's headlines, the former federal chief, whose name remained off the record throughout the investigation, has formally resigned with no replacement appointed. A pause, then the quote appeared in full across the bottom of the screen. I haven't waited to be honored. I've waited for the system to learn when to bow. Rick didn't scowl, didn't scoff. He just stopped wiping down the stainless steel table and looked up. The mop water at his feet stilled. For the first time since his incarceration, he saw her not as a threat, not as an accusation, not as a headline. He saw her as something whole, a standard, a line he had never reached and maybe never understood. He nodded, once, then resumed cleaning but with slower movements, as if the mop was heavier now. Outside, under a white-gray sky, she reached the precinct steps and paused. Not for drama, not for reflection, but because walking away from a battlefield should always be a measured act. She didn't look back, didn't check her phone, didn't wait to be called back in. She had done her duty, and now she wasn't leaving power, she was relinquishing her position. A slow zoom out revealed her figure shrinking against the aging facade of the precinct. The wind picked up, catching the hem of her shirt. Her pants, once mocked, now looked like armor. She didn't walk with the burden, she walked with relief. The badge left behind sat under a beam of morning light slicing through the blinds. It glinted once, faintly, before dimming. Next to it, the note remained untouched. No signature, no initials. only the thick black ink scrawled with steady pressure. In the prison, Rick didn't ask for the remote. He didn't react when a fellow inmate muttered, "Isn't that the lady you asked?" He stayed seated, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the screen, until the segment ended. Then he rose, not in protest, but with a quiet submission that had taken years to find its shape. The next day, a janitor found the badge still on the desk, but the note was gone. No one knew who took it. It didn't matter. It had served its purpose. There were no follow-up interviews, no op-eds from the woman herself. She didn't write a memoir, didn't grant exclusive rights. She simply vanished from the narrative, the way real power does. Once it's done shaping things, it doesn't linger to admire its work. The last shot was a split frame. On one side, Rick, sitting alone by the prison window, his hand pressed against the mesh-covered glass, the echo of her words replaying in his head, not as indictment, but as instruction. On the other, the woman, walking past the precinct gates, her face unreadable, her steps certain, the early sun breaking behind her. No applause, no narration, no echo, just the sound of balance finally settling into place.